Referee. Before we deal with the actual content, I want to clarify a couple of things in advance. We are going to talk a lot about Islamism today. That is what today is all about. It's not about Muslims or Islam. It's about Islamist structures that have very different manifestations. However, we are not generalizing, and we are not talking about Islam as a world religion or Islam as a spiritual need for many people. Secondly, we will not only talk about Islamism, because especially in our work in prison, we noticed very quickly that extremists have quite a lot of parallelisms and similarities whom they share. And the processes and the reasons for radicalization are mostly the same. But more about that later. We even conducted research that shows it is more or less random which political direction people tend to take when they have a need, when they are at a new beginning, when they are looking for a new orientation or support. They look for ideologies that fulfill exactly these needs. It depends on who is the contact person, who is there first and creates attachment and attraction to it. Third, we are not going to just talk about the Islamic State today, because people who don't deal with the issue will think of Tora terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, or people who somehow blow themselves up. We are hardly going to deal with those. Those who work in prison will meet individuals of them. Yet, we define extremism and especially radicalization entirely before radicalization even happens. And I know that many think with the movement or with the decline of IS, the issue is no longer there. Still, if we look around Germany, we notice several trends that show the issue is still there. With the victory over IS, we have perhaps fought the nationwide structures. There are no more Leave projects, there are no Salafist organizations operating nationwide. Many radical mosques are closed. Many organizations are classified. Therefore, we notice the scene has changed and in some cases has become very local. That is, we have people who are radical and work in groups that have no more than 10 to 20 people, no more frequently at the local level. All it takes is a backyard mosque or an apartment to perpetrate exactly these radicalization tendencies. We notice that the scene has become very digital. A lot is happening in social media and less offline. We notice that there are developments of large movements reaching many young people. We have Islamists who record videos that are no more than 20 seconds long and thus have millions of clicks. And these are not the really big issues that might cause alarm bells to go off at the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and others. It's really about small things. Is it okay to celebrate a birthday? Is it okay to celebrate Christmas in some way? How do I treat my friends? Is it okay to get a tattoo? So they find relevance with young people who are looking for answers. As a result, they consume a lot more than just these innocuous question and answer videos. We notice that the scene has become very feminine. So a lot more women are affected. Whenever men are put under pressure, there are free spaces. And the women have these free spaces. We also observe that radicalization tendencies among women have become much more qualitative, but also quantitative. This is not a man's issue. It is also a woman's issue. Even if many people think women have nothing to do with it and only have to look after the children. But they are also very active in propaganda, in proselytizing among women as well as in spreading content. And we also perceive something that is massively overwhelming our society. A certain mixture of mentally ill people and radicalization tendencies that can be very explosive. This is what we experienced in Würzburg, in Hamburg, in Berlin, and what we also experience in other European countries. People who are already ideologically radical, but due to mental instability are ready to use violence in the name of this ideology. This is something that has increased enormously. However, we noticed, and this is the main topic for tonight, that we live in a post-factual age, where extremists of all kinds have a much easier time reaching people, especially through social media. Post-factual means people no longer orientate themselves on facts. They orientate themselves on emotions. Those who manage to activate emotions among young people can gain much more and much faster. That's what federal politicians have told me. You can see it in the trends. You can see it in the decision of election results worldwide. Populists have it much easier. That's why theater education or emotional work with young people is much, much better than just offering some dry political lessons where topics are dealt with in a more complicated way. That is no longer the future. I don't have an answer to that, but we need to be able to find an answer against these populist post-factual offensives that we're seeing, especially in social media. What that answer looks like is a topic that we can't cover in 2 hours. But this is the central issue and will always lead to Islamists, radical right-wing populists and conspiracy theorists having a much easier time reaching people. I will give just one example to illustrate how easy it has become. According to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, we know that people who took to the streets in May 2021 to protest against the war in Gaza almost all consumed a video that went viral very quickly on social media. It was a small video of 20 seconds where you see Jews celebrating with Israeli flags in front of the Wailing Wall, and a tree is burning at the top of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the Temple Mount. For many people it was clear. Jews are celebrating that our holy place is on fire. That was incredibly emotional. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times in Germany. We know what kind of emotions that creates, especially for young people. That was the reason why they took to the streets. But if you analyze the video, you will realize very quickly that the video is not just 20 seconds, but several minutes. The Jews are celebrating because they have a holiday, and the tree was on fire because the Palestinians at the Temple Mount wanted to attack the Jews with fireworks. So this shows how different the reality can be compared to what people see. However, this is not an attempt to portray the Middle East in any way, since it is much more complex. The task of our work is to be where the young people are, to address their issues and to immunize them against radical tendencies. To do that, you have to understand radicalization in the first place. We had a workshop where 12 young people were sitting in a youth prison. 2 people were of interest. One is a convicted right-wing radical because he tried to set fire to an asylum home. A few chairs away sat a Syrian refugee who was so stupid as to post his pictures on the IS Facebook page. Therefore, he was convicted of belonging to the IS. Both made very clear from the beginning that they wanted nothing to do with each other, how they were actually very, very distant from each other. They also looked at each other in distance. In this workshop, we noticed, no matter what topics were addressed, that they think alike on many topics. They were surprised themselves how similar they think. That was the reason why I made the slide about extremism, which I now explain for those who don't see it. After all, we talk a lot about extremism. We have a lot of definitions that come from the constitutional protection or other security apparatuses. That is all well and good, but when we work with young people, they are not people who belong to these organizations. These are not people who really know much about the ideology. They understand extremism first and foremost as an ideology that incapacitates people, meaning it's an ideology that has patriarchal structures in it, whether that's right-wing extremism, conspiracy theories, or Islamism. They are patriarchal ideologies that are very hierarchically structured. This means that young people find this ideology attractive because they can hand over responsibility and thus don't need to make a decision. So there is always another authority telling us which way to go, what is moral, what is immoral, what is good, and what is bad. That is enormously important. Now, that doesn't sound attractive to us mature people, but for people who are overwhelmed with the complexity of this world, that's exactly the answer. That comes back to this post-factual age. The world is complex and not so easy to explain. We now have crisis upon crisis. Many people are overwhelmed. And then these ideologies sound disempowering by being patriarchal and saying there is someone who knows much more than you do and you just have to follow them. That sounds very attractive. For example, when the Al Jazeera channel is watched around the world and every week for an hour an imam who has never dealt in any way with the worlds of people in Europe answers theological questions, it shows how attractive this ideology has become. Or another example, if I am to call Qatar to ask how I treat my neighbors and whether or not I can congratulate them on Christmas, that shows where the appeal of this ideology lies. One of the most common words used by the Salafists is ask the scholars. Meaning, if you have questions, you can't answer them yourself. You are not theologically trained to be able to answer those questions. And they are not just always religious questions, but everyday questions. What kind of education should I do? How do I deal with my friends? How do I deal with my children or with my neighbors? These are all questions that everyone can answer for themselves. But if an entity takes away that responsibility, then that sounds very, very attractive. We once had a co-worker who used to be a Salafist, got out, and said it goes even further than just decisions and behaviors. They even control emotions. He once met a friend he knew from his childhood and always thought he was nice and liked. But he realized that a voice in his head was saying, "You can't like him. He's not a real Muslim. He's an infidel." And that shows that they control not only behavior, but also everyday life. Islamism in particular is an ideology that not only regulates things for 2 or 3 hours a day, but determines people's every moment, 24 hours a day. How they wash, which way they sleep, how they interact with their fellow human beings, what they have to do. What is presented as a burden for all of us is understood as orientation and support by these people. The third factor that appears in every extremist ideology, and this is now enormously important for political education, is skepticism about the mainstream. What is said on the radio and television is not right. In this workshop, the right-wing extremist talked about lying press. The Islamist talked about Zionist press, that is, press controlled by Jews. But both felt that what we see on TV is not the truth. Think of the conspiracy theorists right now. They got big because they hit the streets with a very clear engine. We're being taken for a ride. What's being said is not true. This skepticism of the mainstream is hugely important, meaning we need other channels. The previous channels connect or spread stuff that supports this ideology. If I no longer believe in RAD or ZDF, then I look for the information somewhere else. And where do I look for the information? At channels of which the ideology says they are truth-orientated channels. Conspiracy theorists very quickly end up on Telegram. Islamists also on TikTok, and for right-wing radicals, there are a whole lot of different media that do just that. These media use the attachment of people who get their information from said media to then radicalize them. Another aspect is the affiliation of an elite. These ideologies are attractive because they make people feel like they are something better. Right-wing extremism by DNA, Islamism by faith, and conspiracy theorists because they are not so stupid to believe what doctors and politicians say, or because they have access to information that a normal person does not have. That means I am something better because I belong. I also had a radical phase in my life and was absolutely convinced God was sitting in his seventh heaven, looking down, saying, "This small group understands me. Everyone else does not." I was completely sure that at some point I would conquer Andalusia again. I will conquer Europe again at some point. I was clear, those who oppress me now or don't treat me well will all burn in hell someday. And I will have everything in paradise for eternity that I don't have in this life. This membership in the elite implies a certain valorization of the members of my group and the devaluation of other groups and people. And that again is the next focus: racism. These ideologies cannot treat people as equals. They judge other people. They condemn women who don't wear headscarves, who become more right-wing, people who have different colors and names, who somehow don't belong. Conspiracy theorists denounce all people who wear masks or get vaccinated because they are something better. So in every extremist ideology, there is also some racism to keep that ideology alive in the first place. Conspiracy theories are always there. Even in the SAD workshop, the conspiracy theories were very similar. So 9/11 was an inside job by both the right-wingers and the Islamists. Conspiracy theories are always a shield from outside attacks on the ideology. So when you confront them with facts, when you question them, there are always conspiracy theories. They try to present the ideology so clearly that everything they explain is somehow comprehensible. And in every extremist ideology, there is also some anti-Semitism. I don't know a single one, whether radical left, radical right, Islamist conspiracy theories, that doesn't have an anti-Semitic focus. BDS, right-wing extremism, Islamism. We must not forget that many attacks by IS and terrorists in Europe have also had a Jewish dimension. So Jewish places have been affected. Whether that's the kosher supermarket in Paris, whether that's in Aachen, I think. There were 3 attacks on synagogues recently, probably instigated and organized by the Shiite regime. Then the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels. than an attack on a synagogue in Copenhagen. These are all places that show how the enemy image of the Jew works in each of these radical tendencies. And that actually illustrates how similar they all tick. They always create enemy images, celebrate themselves either as victims or as the good and the moral. And the enemies are different, depending on the ideology. But the Jews, unfortunately, have functioned for thousands of years as a super good enemy image that has always been preserved and somehow can always activate people to hate other people. In every extremist ideology, we find this foci. And now, let's consider why people find this ideology so attractive in the first place. Any questions so far?
Andere Menschen zu hassen. Das sind die Schwerpunkte des Extremismus als sich. In jeder extremistische Ideologie, finden wir diese Schwerpunkte. Und jetzt überlegen wir mal, warum Menschen überhaupt diese Ideologie so attraktiv finden. Fragen bis jetzt?
Participant 1. I have a question about that. Maybe we will get to that later. I'm not an expert on Islam. You said that in Islamism there are so many answers to everyday questions, to all kinds of things, to all of life. But isn't the Quran first and foremost a set of rules anyway? Doesn't the regulation of how to move, how to act, what is right and what is wrong come directly from the Quran? Referee. Maybe. I'm not a theologian, but the question is, what do you do with the texts? Do I take the text as something inflexible that is valid for all people and all times? The Quran is also written in such a way that everything is not always unambiguous. Theology makes it unambiguous. Certain understandings of Islam make it unambiguous. But the basic question is, how do we deal with religions? Are we ready to question these texts? Are we perhaps ready to reinterpret these texts? When you read the Old Testament or the New Testament, these are also sets of rules, some of which are questioned by theology itself and development, or understood in their local historical context. The problem in Islam, as many understand it today, is that the Quran is presented as a text of revelation untouchable. And that's where it starts to become problematic. So the majority of Muslims who pray conservatively wait until they get home and then they pray. And if they somehow have a hard day, then they catch up on the prayers. But if someone says, the Quran says I should pray at 12:30, and there is no opportunity to pray at work or at school, and then demands that they now get a prayer room or leave class to pray, then it's someone who is naturally inflexible with this religion. There are many fatwas, i.e., religious rules or pronouncements that say a professional soccer player who is supposed to give a top performance should not fast when there is a game in Ramadan. Most of them do that. But some, who don't want to bring this flexibility, fast anyway and don't want to make up for it. And that is the inflexibility which can usually lead to a certain radicalization. It doesn't have to, but that is the basic element that makes this theology problematic.
Meistens auch so eine gewisse Radikalisierung führen kann. Muss es nicht sein. Aber das ist der Grundelement, der dann diese Theologie auch problematisch macht.
Steht mit jeder?
Participant 2. In the workshop we had at Quest Mainly Radical the Play, we always focused on the topic of turning points. So what happens when I have a turning point, so to speak, where I can no longer orient myself? And now you also expressed that it is precisely this turning point where people radicalize in one direction or another, or somewhere else, where they somehow need some kind of encouragement or support in order to reorient themselves. Referee. This is exactly the point I would like to address now. If you study psychology, which many here have done, in the first semester, in the lecture Introduction to Psychology, you ask yourself the question, why do some people get sick and others don't? There are many models that try to explain this, for example, the innate disposition to illness and so on. But there is a very simple model that says there are two factors that play a role. Stressors that can create some disease or lability, and coping strategies that then mitigate a person's vulnerability, so to speak. What are stressors? It can be anything. It can be an illness, it can be migration, it can be being in jail, it can be a divorce, it can be a failed transition from school to work. Coping strategies are support from teachers, from people who create a bond, a good environment that these people have. And when the stressors are more pronounced than the coping strategies, there is a lability, a vulnerability. That doesn't automatically lead to some mental illness, but it increases the vulnerability and the likelihood of illness. If we transfer this to radicalization, in this case to Islamism, then we notice, and I also worked for several years in a counseling center where we counseled precisely these people or their parents who had become radicalized, then we notice very quickly that these stress factors are primarily one thing: a missing father figure. By the way, the missing father figure also becomes interesting in right-wing extremism, when we talk later about the attractiveness of this ideology. 90% of the cases are people who come from families where the father has either massively lost authority or is not there at all, doesn't play any role. I have looked after families where I have always spoken to the mother, and only after 3 years I have noticed that there is always a father who has never said anything. He is there, but he doesn't play any role. Other stress factors are depression.
Andere Stressfaktoren sind dann Depressionen.
He is there, but he doesn't interfere. He doesn't function as what the young people expect from a father. There are families where he is not there at all. By the way, it's not just people with an immigrant background. Even a German family can become radicalized because they don't have this father figure. We will get to that. For example, there are a lot of cases of people who came to Europe as a family in 2015. The father was very patriarchal and powerful before, and suddenly the children could speak German much better than him. They settled in Germany much faster than the father. The father can't cope, can't find a job, the children don't take him seriously. Maybe the wife doesn't either. And this break leads to the fact that this father figure is no longer there. In other families, the father simply leaves the family at some point. In other families, he's given up or doesn't play a role. So, very, very different. The most important thing is this subjective feeling. I have the feeling that my father is not there, as much as I would like him to be. And then I'm on the lookout. Other stressors can be critical life events like the death of a close person, which always triggers a personal crisis. Migration can also be a critical life event, especially when it doesn't affect children but adult people who have lived in a country before, who knew everything, who got along and suddenly develop a feeling of helplessness as an adult, who don't know the language, who can't cope, who don't know the culture. This can also be a critical life event. A stay in prison is always a critical life event, especially because people feel like they don't get recognition from their family either. They are at the lowest point of their life, looking for a new beginning. That is very important. It can also be an illness. It can be the transition from school to work that didn't work out. It can be the feeling of not being connected to society, of not having friends, of being lonely. It can be a partnership gone wrong that triggers it. If these factors partly subjectively trigger the feeling that I can't take it anymore, that I have a personal crisis, that I am dissatisfied with my life and carrying a burden, then a window opens. Statistically, that happens between the ages of 13 and 18. That is the critical age where most radicalization occurs. When the perceived burden creates this window opening where people are looking, not for religion or extremism, but for relief, for a new beginning, for the end of personal crisis. And now, as a society, we need to ask us a very important question. Who is in a position today to recognize this personal crisis and make offers? And unfortunately, I've come to realize again and again in all kinds of biographies that I have accompanied that extremists have become the better social workers. They are much better at recognizing in a group of 10 to 20 people whoever is unhappy at the moment and making them offers. Salafists wait outside of prisons. When people are released and their families are not waiting outside, they make them offers. They are in Neukölln on soccer fields, where young people may also be dissatisfied. They are outside discos in the evenings to address those who may also be having a personal crisis. They know who they are addressing. And if they create bonds, if they are there for the people and care, then the probability that these people will go in the direction of radical tendencies is very, very high. Now, you know why neo-Nazis in Eastern Germany invest so much in youth centers and social work, while the Salafists are mainly in front of asylum homes here in Berlin in 2015. As they are looking for exactly these vulnerable people to address and win them over. And the question is, how can we be faster than the Islamists? How can we be faster than the extremists? How can we make offers? Because the moment that attachment is there, the path to radicalization is very, very fast. That is the first psychological level that can lead to radicalization. The second level is the sociological level. We talked about this before. Belonging to an elite also means having an identity, and a very clear, distinct identity. Today, you can be all kinds of things and still hardly get any kind of attention. But if I'm at a school and then tell my teacher that I think Bin Laden is great, then it doesn't even take half an hour until the police, school administration, social workers are all involved in discussing it. Through this identity, therefore, certain statements can gain very clear attention. And that is also something that many young people are looking for. Secondly, identity has become very diverse in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. But if I'm dissatisfied with the way my parents are behaving right now in this society, if I'm dissatisfied with the majority of society and its acceptance of me, how it accepts me. I think it was you who once said, many people with a migrant background go out on the street and even if they were born and raised here, they are always perceived as the Turks, as the migrants, as the Muslims, but they go home and are scolded by their parents for being too German. That means that here and there they have not arrived. They are between all stools. And then comes an offer that says, I give you the opportunity to separate yourself from your parents, from the majority of society. That sounds wonderfully. Salafists in particular, but also neo-Nazis, are even visibly clear about the identity they carry. A clear, unambiguous identity that gives these people the feeling of being better, of belonging to an elite. And this works precisely for those people who are searching for an identity and have not found it so far. Especially when ambivalence, ambiguity, and tolerance are not present. One can have very different identities. One can be German and Muslim, German with an immigrant background, Muslim and secular. If all that doesn't work well and I see unambiguity, then the likelihood that I will find such ideologies good is enormous. Now, Lutz, to your question. You can't explain these phenomena without the ideology. You can't explain it only sociologically and psychologically. I know many believe Islamism arises as a reaction to mainstream society or a reaction to discrimination. That explains maybe 5% of Islamism, but 95% remains unexplained. That doesn't explain why people without an immigrant background become radicalized. It doesn't explain why countries like Saudi Arabia are the expert champions of IS fighters. They come from a very homogenized society. They are not oppressed. They weren't the deadbeats either. They weren't those who are uneducated. These were doctors. They were lawyers. Even if you look at the statistics in Europe, you find that the Islamists from the UK who joined IS are not failures at all. They are people who are at leadership level.
Der Ton ist weg. Hallo? Also hier kommt kein Ton mehr an.
Ja, bei mir ist der Ton auch weg.
Jetzt? Okay.
Jetzt
Funktioniert?
Ja.
Super. Ja, ich spiele zu viel.
That is, in addition to the psychological, sociological factors, where experiences of discrimination and racism also play a role, we also have to talk about the ideological foundation of this ideology. It is not different from what I explained before with extremism. Islamism, or let's say Islamist groups, have not invented anything new. In Germany, they have brought two additional points to this ideology. That is the legitimization of violence, which is by no means always present in certain understandings of Islam, and above all, and here we are also challenged, the ability to anchor this ideology with youth culture. This means that it is no longer the imams who address the guest worker generation in Turkish, i.e. actually only the grandpas and grandmas, and have no idea of the worlds of the young people in the third generation and, above all, do not speak German. Modern Islamism are people who speak German, who are mainly present in social media and who answer questions this new generation is concerned with. These are questions about tattoos, about dealing with the majority of society, what kind of work do I do, how I deal with discrimination, and so on. So the issues young people are concerned with have been linked in a modern way to a very old ideology. We will now address all the other factors one by one. These are unfortunately aspects that are very ingrained in many understandings of Islam, whether that is in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Palestine. This is the understanding of Islam that creates the foundation on which radicals build their ideology. On each of these points, there is the explanation of why this is so attractive to young people, but also the solution for pedagogy. The first point is literalism. By the way, this is a term that comes from Catholic theology. Literalism means I must not question the sacred texts. I must literally understand and live them as they are written. What we were talking about before, a critical reflection on the texts, arguing with God, questioning, perhaps reforming the sacred texts, is completely non-existent. A certain Pierre Vogel, one of the most famous Salafist persons a few years ago, by now he doesn't play a big role, but he's coming back, said, Islam is the truth. And if it's the truth, then it doesn't matter if you like it or not, you have to follow the truth. And that's where it starts to become dangerous. To follow blindly without understanding. Ask the scholars. In other terms, I am not able to understand these texts. 2 weeks ago, I was in a school in Wilmersdorf, not far from here, and I was discussing with 2 classes. And at some point I said, I want to argue with God. So, what is written in the Quran, that is my religion. I read it with interest. But I want to question the words I realize I don't correspond to my moral conception. And they almost freaked out, because that's exactly what they didn't understand. For an hour they asked me the same question over and over again. How can you argue with God? You can. Even in the Quran, there are many approaches where prophets have argued with God, where they did not agree with his decision, where they questioned that. Again, the Quran can be a solution if you interpret it in a different way. Unfortunately, it can also be the reason for all these radicalization tendencies, if you literally understand it, interpret it, and pass it on. And these young people have a problem with this statement, as they bring together patriarchal structures with a patriarchal understanding of Islam. And they can't imagine questioning authority. However, questioning authority is exactly the pedagogical method we should follow in working with it. So, put differently, critical thinking, questioning are the signs that can take us far in the fight against radicalization. Now, we don't have to somehow question the Quran in every workshop. But if, for example, as Yilmaz will show tomorrow, we question and criticize the father and his method of education, bring other possibilities and create alternatives, then we give young people the opportunity to become more mature, to form their own opinions. And those who are mature, who think for themselves, who question, will not become radicalized, no matter in which direction. But this becomes even more complex in the understanding of Islam, since a term called fear pedagogy is added to this patriarchal literalism, which, by the way, also comes from the Catholic Church, even if they have abolished limbo. It is something that can be found in different religions. That is, an image of God that is not merciful, that is not set up for a discourse, that is not set up for exchange, but rather works with fear. Either you follow me or you will be punished. An angry radical God who is very clear. Previously, I said 90% of people who are radicalized come from families where the father figure is not there. This is the answer. So, God is the substitute for the father figure, and a very clear father figure. A father can fail. A God is all-powerful. A God cannot be questioned. A God is someone who can punish with hell. These are all aspects that are, of course, very difficult to question, especially by young people who have grown up with them. But that's what needs to be questioned pedagogically in order to be able to free people from saying, I live my life, I do what I want, and punishment is not what is decisive for me now, how I have to live. But you also have to put these punishments into perspective and not present them in their absoluteness. But that's what makes it attractive. It's all absolute. It's all right and wrong. It's all unambiguous. It is not unambiguous. It is not clear in the Quran either. It is not unambiguous in theology either. But in this, unfortunately, very widespread understanding of the Islam, which above all docks itself to patriarchal structures, it is very clear. I sometimes ask myself the question, who came first? A punishing God or a punishing father? And by now I believe that the punishing father came first, as he completely supports this image of God. He supports him in his method of education. He acts exactly like this father. Actually, there is no difference. Participant 2. The whole radicalization, as you just said, that's one way. But the other, which you now mentioned again, is once again the confrontation with theology, no matter which faith it is. That the person must also be able to free himself in the theology from this child's faith, which is somehow given to him. That doesn't matter. These images of God are always changing and must always change. Otherwise, man will not mature. And somehow other philosophical or political theologies are needed, which say, okay, the possibility of a change of religion must be given and other means and ways are needed to lead to it. Referee. Perhaps you would be surprised. There was this coming of age at one time in the history of Islam. There also was this questioning. But any radical ideology is childish, is unequivocal. That's why it's attractive. That is someone who is in a personal crisis, someone who is of interest to us because they're making certain developments that we are concerned about. These are not the ones who deal with theology in an adult way. These are not the ones who have perhaps studied theology and experience religion in an ambiguous, tolerant way. But those are the ones who bring this unambiguity. And that's why this ideology has such a big lead-in among young people. Anyone who comes to us and says that God may have said certain things that I don't understand or don't like is not a radical person. He is a person who deals with his religion in a completely different way. The ones we are addressing here are now the ones who want and need exactly this childlike absolute way. Participant 2. No, I think you should just give people the opportunity to say, okay, think about religion and interpret it differently and look and also observe your life in religion as a whole. And then maybe you will discover things that would catapult you out of this ideology, help you find a way out, that you no longer have to think in this way. Religion is somehow a lifelong process that starts at some point and ends at some point by saying, okay, God is fine, but sometimes you can do without him or yes. Referee, I'm with you, but the question is, how exactly? Participant 2, you have to give them the opportunity to talk about it. Maybe it needs another kind of workshops where you see this kind of possibility without being something radical behind it right away. Yes, that's what I mean. Referee, I know that is our approach. But our approach is not to question religion, because then many people shut down very quickly and understand that as an attack. By proxy, we are questioning the Father, which many people can relate to. By proxy, we try to activate this maturity, to question it. We have many young people who actually find it very interesting once they have started to question and actually feel like forming their own opinion. This group asks the question, how can you argue with God 10,000 times? That's exactly the kind of pedagogy we need. The moment they see someone who says, I am a Muslim, and I question God, and I argue with him, that is a counter-narrative we don't know at all. It is the kind of prevention work we need.
Und das ist schon auch eine Art von Präventionsarbeit, die wir brauchen.
Participant 3. Maybe again about the Hadith and how Islam works. Basically, how the religion is understood. There is not only talking about the Quran, but also about the life of the Prophet. First of all, they determine how authentic the sources are, and then a hierarchy is made. And afterwards it is said, yes, this is roughly how the Prophet and the people around him lived. And this is the right way to live. So it's not just about the Quran, but also about the fact that a certain culture is being imported into today's world, where people say that we should do things exactly the way people lived back then. So I think this form of fundamentalism, that there is no movement involved, that you should do it just like the Prophet, that is not just about, well, the term Salafist also comes from the ancients, meaning how did the first Muslims live up to a certain generation, and then that is applied. And I think this aspect is so often neglected because we look at the Quran. When I look around in the internet, a lot of what all these preachers say comes from the Hadith. So they don't recite the Quran, but then look at the Hadith and say, look, the Prophet did it this way. Then we should do it this way. The Prophet dressed like this, we should do it like this. The Prophet had a beard, so we should do that too. So, referee. This mimicking is exactly what they do. Why has Salafism become so attractive, for example? It's one of the most radical forms of Islam. Even in many Muslim countries, it's not so popular because it's actually a contradiction to modernity. After all, it's something that takes religion literally. Being in a room where women sit with men is not allowed. Eye contact with a woman is not allowed. Working in a restaurant that may also serve alcohol is not allowed. You have to pray 5 times a day. The first time is at 4 in the morning in winter, even earlier in summer. It is not so easy. But why exactly has this kind of Islamism become so attractive? Because it is very simple. It says origin. That what the Prophet and the successors of him did, the 3rd generation, that was the real Islam, and we should follow it. Meaning, how he brushed his teeth, that is how we should do it today. How he went to the toilet, that is how we should do it today. What style of clothes he wore, that is what we should wear. It sounds exhausting, but for young people, it is a complete relinquishment of this responsibility. That means I do not have to deal with what pair of jeans I buy. There's only one style of dress that I follow. And that just makes it more visible, but also much easier. Participant 1. Yes, we had this thought in Paris the other day. We had a conference on the topic of Islamism, and it seemed to me, following your train of thought, that this radicalization, Islamism or right-wing extremism, are ultimately response to globalization, to this complexity of the world, which is becoming more and more complicated. One no longer understands who triggered which crisis where, who was responsible for what and how. Everything interacts with each other, and ultimately it's a reaction, a reactionary movement. So back to simplicity, where you can still find a foothold, because people are just baseless in globalization. I think when we work with young people, we also have to help them find a foothold. I think that is very important. Referee. I am not sure that globalization means baselessness. I think it's much more the sensitivities and the personal crisis of these people. The complexity overwhelms. But was the world never not so complex? I don't think so. I think we're just waking up from an illusion that the world used to be simpler. It wasn't simpler. Participant 1. Yes, but I think the processes of change has accelerated. Some people can't keep up with that. That's also digitalization, LGBTQ, etc. Everything is constantly changing and being discussed, and if you're progressive, you think it's great, and that things are evolving. But if you're conservative, then maybe you're afraid of it. Then you ask yourself, okay, where's the support, where's the familiar? Referee. Although progressives can also become radicalized because they want certain changes their way. Participant 1. I didn't mean to question that. Referee. To your question, if you look, what are the narratives that modern right-wingers carry today? What are they talking about? What do they actually want? Then you'll notice... Participant 1. Well, it's essentially about keeping anything foreign for me in some way, and we covered that in the workshop last week. So back to me, back to home, to a 50s worldview. I mean, it's not quite as far back there as it is in Islam, where it goes back over 1,000 years, but it kind of goes back to where one thinks it was simple. However, that is an illusion. Referee. Because the identity was very simple. That means it's also a reaction to a perceived loss of identity. And that's exactly what we observe on the other side. A Syrian father who came to Germany in 2015 with 2 children said, "In Syria life was easy." He comes to Germany, the children go to school. But they come home with German songs, with German friends, with a different language. And I can be super relaxed about that, or I can say, oh my God, what's happening right here? What's going to happen to my kids? I want to teach them the language. I want to prevent them from adopting other identities. And in response, I radicalize my own identity. In Syria, this would be completely normal. Every person who grows up also changes his identity. Every generation has different priorities. But in this feeling of being foreign, in these fears of losing identity, which are very central on both sides, the reaction is, of course, radicalization. Because in this way, I then force my children to go a certain way.
Von beiden Seiten ist natürlich die Reaktion Radikalisierung, weil dadurch zwinge ich meine Kinder auch dann einen bestimmten Weg zu gehen.
Participant 4.
Fragen.
Unintelligible.
Ja.
في كتير بتلاقيهم على القنوات التلفزيونية بينشروا الإسلام وبيدعوا الإسلام بس منيح فقط عن التجارة. شو تعليقك على هذا الموضوع؟ إنه تأثير كتير كبير على العالم. كتير. يعني أنا بعرف ناس كتير متجهة وراهم وبتسمع كلامهم ورغم إنه أنا أي حدا عاقل بيشوفهم بيعرف إنه هذا كذب. يعني ما له علاقة بالقرآن إذا أنا بدي أقرأ قرآن ما له علاقة بالقرآن فشو تعليق حضرتك على هذا الموضوع؟
Referee, you set out that you know quite a lot of families who came to Germany very secular, had nothing to do with religiosity and all, and rather developed their radicalization or religiosity here in a very radical way. And that is the answer to the fear and exactly what constitutes the ideology. And the second question is this proselytizing, which has become an industry, not only on television through channels in Arabic or in Turkish or in I don't know what. That was not the case 20 years ago at all. Maybe you saw some religious content on TV for 5 or 10 minutes, but the fact that today there are complete channels that do nothing but answer religious questions and make an industry out of it, that's exactly the simplification that young people need and that this society needs and that we also need. I mean, if we look how Turkey was in the 70s, how Syria was in the 70s, how Palestine was in the 70s. I don't know about you, but in our country, there were hardly any women with headscarves. Today, there are hardly any women without headscarves. If you look at Iran, look at Afghanistan, there is also a certain religious regulation that takes place in societies that need an answer to something or are a product of certain proselytizing that such channels have also represented. And today we are dealing with two groups, with refugees who are looking for a religiosity and who also find it in their Arab channels, which have also an interest that people do not arrive in this country. And then we have the TikTok imams and the Instagram imams who are trying to reach people in the third and fourth generation in Germany, and everything is very emotional. And it's that emotionality that I'm very concerned about. This is not just a transmission of religious content. This is not just an answer to a question. This is the staging. This is the victim discourse. This is the emotionality. These are the enemy images that are created there in a very subtle way and within not even half a minute. I convey all my content in a way that is appropriate for young people, in the language of these young people. And the question we should ask ourselves is, where are we actually? Where are counter-narratives on social media? Where are Democrats who perhaps also convey freedom, self-determination, complexity, ambiguity, tolerance, also in an emotional way that resonates with young people? And I don't see much there, do you? You're a young person after all. Exactly. To then move on so it doesn't take so long, Islamism always has, as we said, anti-Semitism as its focus. It's an ideology of inequality, which means it devalues people who don't belong. Other people are valued because they belong. Rejection of renewal, so what you just said, arguing with God, developing religion, would be completely rejected. Liberal Islam is a dirty word for these people. Some renewal is completely rejected, and it's always been there in the history of theology. This is not new. I recommend the books of a colleague of mine who is head of the theological faculty in Münster, Muhannad Khoshide. He really represents the old theology not only in Germany but worldwide and shows how Islam or religion can be understood differently than some of these radicals do today. Duration and missionary work is something that makes this ideology so attractive because it gives young people the feeling that they have a task. That means young people who had nothing to do can now go everywhere in the streets, in homes, in circles of friends, and save people from their miserable lives. Teach them the truth. Exactly this claim to exclusivity, this uniqueness, I own the truth, everyone else is wrong, and whoever criticizes me for that doesn't criticize me myself, but criticizes my religion, my identity, my existence. So that's why the reactions are sometimes very, very strong. Gender roles, tabooing of sexuality. It's interesting that every regime, every sect always tries to control sexuality. because that's how you control people and their consciousness. And that's what Islamism does by demanding gender segregation, by making sexuality completely taboo and portraying it as a sin. This docks with patriarchal structures that make sexuality taboo for traditional patriarchal reasons. It is just made more religious. Conspiracy theories and civil rhetoric in response to the complexity and victimhood and enemy images involved, which are found with every ideology. In summary, this ideology has become attractive worldwide because it offers a simple enemy image. Good and evil, bad and right. That's what young people need. That's what they want. Hence, the rise in anti-Semitism, especially Israel-related anti-Semitism. The Middle East is very complex. You can see that if you just look at the last 2-3 years and see how more and more countries, Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries, have become allies of Israel, and on the other hand, other countries are not joining in. It's very complex. But for the young people who follow this ideology, Israel is the enemy. Satan and the Palestinians are the victims. This simplification is what makes the ideology attractive, but also in a peace arriving. We talked about personal crisis before, people who are somehow dissatisfied with their lives. And all of a sudden, when they embrace this ideology, then they feel like they get inner peace. It's interesting. There are many biographies of Islamists who tell how their life was before and how their life is there right now after they adopted this ideology. Before, they talk about chaotic conditions, about I lived by the devil, my life was shit. And then they talk about being born again, about arriving, about peace, about contentment. This ideology also ends their personal crisis, because it gives the possibility to start again, to have orientation and support. Enormously important. Identity, demarcation, social contacts. One does not pursue and practice this ideology alone. One is always a part of a group that perceives people as brothers, as members who are there for them without ifs and buts. A heroic status. I am someone. I want to achieve something. I am chosen by God. I am wanted by God. Emotionality that these people can achieve much better in a professional way. Rebellion against parents, against the majority society, against all those who don't belong. Sense of superiority. I am better.
Nicht dazugehören. Überlegenheitsgefühl. Ich bin besser. Ich bin jetzt so, ja, genau, meine Rebellion.
My rebellion, having a task and mission to be knowledgeable, but also to be there for just cause. And of course, orientation, support, and clear rules. These are the reasons why this ideology is so attractive to these people. Of course, we are not talking about all young people. Many cannot and do not want to participate with it. But these are the ideological foundations that make this ideology attractive. We cannot and must not wait until people have a completed worldview and are being watched by the Office of the Protection of the Constitution or have joined some terrorist organization. Prevention work, pedagogy, means reaching people before they become radical, immunizing them, and giving them food for thought so that they do not become radicalized. Participant 2. Unintelligible. And then I have all these colleagues around me who go with me to the mosque or whatever and celebrate. I have a world of experience that is good for me. Consequently, I also need a different kind of world of experience because I don't think it's enough just to think about it. It needs other ways where the emotionality and the experiences are lived in another way as possibility or as an alternative. Referee. But you're not talking about prevention, you're talking about radicalization. Someone who is already inside this ideology cannot be reached by a thought-provoking impulse. So we have two levels in our work. We have prevention work, i.e. people who are perhaps susceptible or have certain points. And in the case of radicalization, it's much more about looking at the biographical breaks that people have had that have led them to go there. And we have to present these biographical breaks through biographical work, through emotionality, through bonding, through being there, through building trust. In prevention work, working with thought-provoking ideas does not mean think about it, but rather I will show you counter-narratives. Our staff all have immigration background and deal with their religion in a very different way. We try to find an emotional access to themselves by performing theater pedagogical role plays that they know, that they have grown up with, and thus perhaps also question their own biography and get alternatives on how things can be done differently. Participant 2. But if you do a role play, then he gets new experiences. That's something like that. Referee. Yes, of course. Participant 2. Yes, and he's also already on a different path. Referee. Well, but we have role plays that we play that create a contradiction in the young people. They say, that's exactly the kind of father I want to have. Why are you questioning him? That's also an argument. Participant 5, contradiction or resistance? Referee, contradiction and resistance, both. Participant 2, it's also about being able to endure this contradiction and this resistance. That is the be-all and end-all of the whole story. Referee, I don't know if you remember, we have someone from North Africa who we were role-playing. Tomorrow we might role-play that too. And then he started talking about his father beating him up in a very emotional way. You could tell he was very emotionally engaged. 5 minutes later, it was important for him to speak up again and say, I just told you about my experience, but don't think I'm questioning my father. If now my father comes in and tells me my red pens are blue, then they are blue. I'm not questioning that. So that's also an emotional argument. Participant 1. Can we take a quick look into the chat? I have to leave the Zoom. Okay. So I've been dealing with radicalization professionally for quite a long time now in theater projects, and I've been doing research on it for a long time. And I'm getting more and more the impression that the topic of Islamism, for example, it's not really about Islam or the Quran, but about identity. And above all, about an attitude to life.
Zum Beispiel beim Thema Islamismus es ganz wenig den Islam geht oder den Koran, es geht Identität.
Referee, I have to disagree with you there. Participant 1, yes, Islam is maybe used or the Quran is used for that. Referee, it's about how you define extremism. So this group that is going to IS or doing attacks, yes, it has to do with Islam, but that is not the determining reason, but rather identity and so on. Participant 1, that's what I was trying to say. Referee, exactly, but there are people who have a certain expression of their religiosity. I will never call them extremists, not even radical, but in our work we meet them every day and we are challenged by them. If someone says, in my religion I'm not allowed to celebrate Christmas, well, you can, but that brings a certain line of conflict. If someone says, I don't want to sit next to a woman, you're allowed. Guaranteed. It is our freedom. But that brings certain conflict. Or if you say, Islam says this and that, and Christians will all burn in hell. So also arguing religiously, theologically. Nevertheless, this is something that concerns us. And I will say one more thing. If we go even deeper, even if many of those are religiously illiterate, no religious theological institute worldwide from the Muslims has been able to hold on with the IS. Even Al-Hazar has not called the IS an infidel or un-Islamic. So the IS has always been theologically able to argue against them when they have been challenged. That means one has this speech, these are brothers gone astray, but they are still brothers. That means theologically IS has not invented anything new. It has just exaggerated. That means it has to do with religion. And that's why I tend to be a little allergic to this question. Participant 1. Is religion worded wrong? I may have not meant it that way either. Maybe no, I meant something else. I mean why people become radicalized, why they become Islamists. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with religion. That's what I meant when I said, I've worked a lot with young people in the social flashpoints in Altenessen, etc., where there are very many fundamentalist Muslims among the young people. And from my point of view, that has a lot to do with their life world. Why they find it so attractive is exactly what you've been talking about. For me, the key is to look at everything. How do they actually live and what are they looking for? Yes, and what you also said is absolutely important. How can we support them so that they don't join such a movement? And how can we understand what they need? Participant 3. Unintelligible. Referee. So I will say it again. Can I be heard now? Okay. Super. Prevention work can be very different. The work that we do is not the only truth and the only solution. You have to reach different people very differently. There are projects that are good at reaching a certain target group, other projects reach other target groups. It's good that it's diverse, and it will always be the case that we should specifically find an answer to Islamism. Digitally, but also in our prevention work. But I've come to believe that we need a concept for society as a whole, as an answer to the post-factual age. So how can we make it harder for populists to reach people more easily? And I see things in the black. I know federal politicians who say the future is populist because we don't know how to deal with it. Even if you just look at Germany, the AfD, the conspiracy theorists, they own issues much easier than the democratic parties and votes. They don't make it. And my question now is in terms of theater education. What can be a democratic, emotional response to this simplification? I don't have a solution, but that's exactly what we should briefly discuss now.
Viel einfacher Themen als demokratischen Parteien. Die schaffen es nicht. Und meine Frage ist jetzt in Bezug auf Pädagogik und Bezug auf Theaterpädagogik. Wie kann eine Antwort, eine demokratische, emotionale Antwort auf diese Vereinfachung sein? Ich habe keine Lösung, aber das ist genau das, was wir vielleicht auch jetzt kurz diskutieren soll.